Good morning, everyone. Morning. Welcome to our session on the edge of medicine and ageing. My name's Greg Johnson. I work in our insurance business, and today we're very, very lucky to have a guest from Harvard, David Sinclair. I'd like to welcome members of staff, the AMP board, partners, and the media and online community who are with us today. Today we have Pam Jack, who's a partner at Minter Ellison, and Pam is going to step up shortly to introduce David Sinclair. A few housekeeping notes. There's a Wi-Fi available in the room. It gives you easy access to content, to the AFR site, and so forth. I think the details are on the screen at some point. Today we will have David give, I think, what will be a great presentation, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So, Pamela, welcome to the stage.
Thanks, Greg. I'm delighted to be here this morning on behalf of Minter Ellison to welcome the very impressive Professor David Sinclair. David is a professor in the Department of Genetics and the co-director of the Paul F. Glenn Centre for Biology of Aging at Harvard Medical School. He is also a professor at the School of Medicine at the University of New South Wales, the co-founder of several biotechnology companies, and co-founder and co-chief editor of the scientific journal Aging. Professor Sinclair has been featured in Time magazine's list of 100 most influential people in the world, in particular because of his work on anti-aging. He is currently working with NASA to see if astronauts can be protected from the impact of cosmic radiation when they travel in space. No doubt many of you are most interested to hear about the work that David has done and for which he is best known, and that is understanding why we age and how to slow its effects. I'm very much interested in hearing about that in particular, and I'm sure I'm not alone. I'm very pleased to note that Professor Sinclair is originally from Australia and still calls Australia home, in the words of the great song. Whilst obviously we do lose some great talent to overseas institutions, we have extraordinary talent here in Australia, some of which was on show last night at the Amplify Ignite session, which saw 20 PhD students pitch their research to judges in the time limit of 150 seconds. And we were very proud to be the sponsors of that session. I'd like to take this moment to thank AMP for the opportunity to partner with AMP in this very innovative and inspiring Amplify Festival. We're very pleased to work closely with AMP and consider it a very important partnership. I hope you all enjoy today's amazing session, particularly this session, The Edge of Medicine and Ageing, and no doubt hearing a little bit more about the beneficial effects of red wine. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Professor David Sinclair.
Well, thank you, Pamela, and to Minter Ellison for sponsoring this. And Greg, thanks for the chance to speak. Can you all hear me up the back there? That's good. I haven't lost my Australian accent too much, I hope. I do actually have a lab here at UNSW, so I regard myself as a global citizen, and certainly of US and Australia. And I see also my role in being able to bridge both the academic community and the business communities. I have a couple of companies down here in Australia as well, which we're trying to grow the biotech industry down here. But I'm not here to talk about those things. What I'd like to tell you about is what I see the future looking like. And we are really, in my view, at a turning point in human history, in as much as it was back in the 1920s and 30s when antibiotics were starting to be developed, and even earlier when the Wright brothers had just shown that it's possible to fly. And the aging field is at a similar time point. The question is whether we were born 1 or 2 generations too early out of the last 100,000 generations, or are we going to reap the benefits of this new technology. Okay, so this is my son. He's a generic boy, and he's there to represent the future of the world. And he's currently now 9 years old, and his world, of course, is going to be very different than ours. By the time he's essentially my age, nearly 50, the world is going to look very different. And we tend to just think about Apple Watches and the internet. There are things, though, that we cannot imagine right now. But I want to give you an insight into what's going to happen with medicine and biology by the time he's 50. It's going to be a radical world, and it's going to be, in my opinion, even more exciting and more different than we can even imagine today. By the way, he's holding there a DNA kit from 23andMe. And so he's had his DNA tested. He knows that he has a gene predisposing him to obesity and diabetes, and he's already trying very hard to make sure he lives a healthy lifestyle, though in the US that's kind of difficult. But he's trying. But obviously that's really quite amazing that someone who's not even 10 yet knows their genetics and knows some of the potential problems throughout his life. We've never lived in such an age. He also knows that he has a couple of really great longevity genes, and that he may live well as long as he doesn't become obese. So these are some historical mortality curves. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these. These are basically from life history tables. The one that you see on the very left is early man. Then we have further over there what it was like at the turn of the century, more recently the 1990s, where what's happening is we're rectangularizing the mortality curve. And what we're hoping to do as a field that I'm here to represent is to square that curve, but also to push it out to the right as much as possible. But the first thing we want to do is to square it. So the ideal world is that people can live into their 90s and beyond, but the week before they die, they can be playing tennis and hanging out with their great-grandkids and having a great life, being productive. They don't have to be employed to be productive, of course. We know that grandparents and great-grandparents can help with looking after kids and that kind of thing. But we also have evidence that we'll be able to push the maximum human lifespan out as well. Now, there are detractors. There are people that calculate that that's a boundary that we just can't get past. But that would be like saying that the Wright brothers were going to fail because we've never flown before. And I want to tell you today that there's lots of reasons for thinking not only will we square that curve, but we will go far beyond that. And you've probably heard that the first person to live to 150 is already born. I think the Prime Minister here quoted me on that. I still truly believe that. And the technology is going incredibly quickly. And a lot of it, I'm sure you're not even aware of. So just to drive home a point, that there's a lot of confusion. When I give talks in the media, on the radio, often there's a caller that says, well, I don't want to live longer. I'm already frail. I'm 85. Don't make me live longer. I don't want to live. And that caller is missing the point. What we're talking about is technologies that will keep people younger for longer, not older for longer. And this slide actually demonstrates it really well. So we used to have a short life with health and a period of about 10 years where we were not very active and eventually died. This red zone, of course, is extremely expensive to the world's economy. And it's only going to get worse as the world gets older and older proportionally. You know, now we've done even worse. We've treated particular diseases, such as cardiovascular disease, been very effective as doctors doing that. But we're not forestalling all aging. Our brains still get old, even though our bodies continue on. And this has led to a world where we have a lot of elderly people who just continue on but are not productive. And that's the worst case scenario. So what we're talking about today, well, I'll tell you about, are technologies that will do the bottom part, which is not only make us live as long as we currently do or beyond, but make those years productive and healthy. And I've never met a person yet that if they are healthy and happy, that they don't want to live another day. Typically, those people want to live another 30, 40, 50 years. And also I was once asked, well, why would you want to live beyond 150? And I said, well, when you're 150 and you're still playing tennis, you're not going to say, okay, I'm happy to die tomorrow. There's just no way, unless you're crazy. What about 1,000 years? Well, That's only 20 times what I've already lived, and that went by within a blink of an eye. I don't know if we'll live to 1,000, but we could live in a world where people are very productive up until the last moment. Then again, if I told you 200 years ago that people would be still playing golf in their 90s, you also would have laughed. Okay, so we've got how are we going to afford this? And our current medicine is really not very good at saving money. This is a study that was done a few years ago by the RAND Corporation. And what you can see there is that a lot of these medical treatments are so extremely expensive, and they only add a year or two of life. And so, for example, a pacemaker, in terms of the cost to the country, $1.4 million in the US gives you an extra year of life. Contrast that with what I'm talking about, which is an anti-aging molecule, for want of a better term. Essentially, we're mimicking diet and exercise with a pill. That is about $9,000 to get an extra year of life. I think it'll be cheaper. Eventually, once this becomes a commodity, these pills only cost a few cents a day. And you may get an extra 10 years out of that. And that's one of the most economical ways to improve the economy that I can even think of. So you're probably wondering, how do you make an anti-aging pill? This sounds like science fiction. We've never done this before. How do we do it? Well, the good news is we actually know how to build a Wright brothers, a Wright Flyer. We've actually done it many times in the world. My lab has routinely extended the lifespan in warm, furry little animals. The only question is, how do we get these drugs to be proven in humans and to be sold over the counter or prescribed by your doctor? So it's really not a question of if, it's just a question of when. And I think we would already have these medicines if it wasn't for the high cost of drug development and the regulations that really slow things down. So we've had a real paradigm shift. Anyone who still talks about antioxidants extending lifespan hasn't read the scientific literature lately. Over the last 20 years, what we've actually discovered is that it's not antioxidants that are important. In fact, antioxidants extremely rarely have ever had an impact on lifespan of any species. What we've realized is that there are inbuilt protection mechanisms in our body. We know when we exercise, we get health benefits. We know when we don't eat a lot of food, calorie restrict, we get healthier. And now we know why. There are these inbuilt protective mechanisms. So instead of this old view in the 1990s that we just wear out and die, what we now know by this analogy is that we've got these protectors of the genome, protectors of the proteins in our cells, and we don't just know that they exist, we now are understanding how to control them. So the equivalent would be that I can now get out the megaphone and shout at these guys, and of course there's women included here, and say, get up early in the morning, don't stop working, we have a job to do, the body needs to fight back against disease and aging. Now, a lot of people ask me, why don't these people, these enzymes in our body always work at their maximum? Well, there's two main reasons. One is that it's quite expensive. It burns a lot of energy to repair the body constantly. And up until 100 years ago, there wasn't that much energy to go around. Now we're flooded with it. And we don't remember that at one point it was rather dangerous to expend all your energy and lose weight. The second thing is that aging is different than other diseases in that aging happens through a lack of natural selection. So once you've reproduced yourself and had a couple of offspring or more, you're pretty much at the mercy of entropy and your body just falls apart. And there's no selection for you to live beyond about 60 years, unfortunately. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. There are plenty of species that live beyond 60 years. There are some species of mammal that live over 200. So it's not a law of biology that we hit. We can go beyond that. We know other life forms do, and we're learning how they actually do it. And the way they do it is that they have the same defenses we do, but they keep them turned on constantly, whereas we don't. Right now, as you're sitting there, your body's more complacent, says there's no trouble, I don't need to defend myself. But if you go out and go for a run, or you don't eat lunch today, you'll stimulate these processes. So what are these processes? Let me tell you all about them. The other reason for being optimistic is the following. There are people that naturally live a long time. This is a family, a couple of individuals from a family that almost always lives over 100 in a healthy state, a couple of New Yorkers. A friend of mine near Barzilai studies these families, and they definitely inherit longevity. And the thing we often forget is when we extend lifespan, in our studies and in the future, we're not talking about having someone who's elderly live longer. We're talking about someone who's youthful living longer. And you can see with these guys, I guess you can tell, they're certainly loving life. I can tell you that they love life. And the guy who's 100, he'd be happy to go on another 50 years if he could. The other reason for optimism is this. This is a study on calorie restriction. It's a diet that I think a few people here might have tried. I tried it for about a week and gave up. It's not easy being hungry most of the time. And actually the feeling of hunger is thought to be part of the benefit, unfortunately. But when you calorie restrict animals and even little organisms like worms and yeast cells, they live longer. This is the most universal way to extend lifespan on life on Earth. And this is a study that was done at the University of Wisconsin and is now being continued by one of my former postdocs that I trained a few years ago. And what this shows is that these monkeys live longer and they are healthier. And in fact, I should say it the other way around. They're healthier and therefore they live longer. You can never separate the two, actually. In fact, I don't know how to make an animal live longer in a sick state. The only reason they live longer is they're not getting cancer and heart disease and these other diseases. Now, they didn't live a lot longer. I think there's an argument about whether they lived 5-10% longer. But there's absolutely no doubt that they were healthier. And you can even see from these pictures what a big difference there is. And I can tell you in my lab, when we compare the mice that are on calorie restriction diets versus not, there's a huge difference. You can see that one's running around, beautiful black coat, and the other one is scrawny, sitting in the corner, not very active, not enjoying life. So yeah, eat less if you can, and if you can't, for the rest of us, myself included, we're working on a pill. Yeah, so as I've said, it works in all organisms, but the question is, how does it work? And it's not antioxidants, it's these defense pathways. And so there's a number of molecules that are now known to mimic caloric restriction by activating these defenses. And they're in top journals. You know, Nature is the top journal in the world. We published the resveratrol story, as Pamela mentioned. There's a molecule called rapamycin, which is a drug that affects the immune system. And metformin is really interesting. Metformin you can be prescribed by your doctor for diabetes. And if you go to Thailand, you can buy it at a chemist over the counter. And that, at least based on retrospective studies of humans, people who are on metformin tend to live healthier and even potentially longer, even though they started out with high blood sugar and diabetes compared to the rest of us. So I'm trying to help my colleague Nir Barzilai, who I mentioned earlier, to do a study in humans to test whether metformin actually does extend healthy lifespan. But I want to tell you about the story about resveratrol today, the red wine story, and where it's come since 2003, since we first increased sales of red wine by 30%. Before I do, I threw in this slide because I thought I might have the time. We can also not just delay aging, we can speed it up. In my lab, we think we've figured out why we age. And we haven't published this yet, but I wanted to share it with you. We think that aging is not due to disruptions in the DNA. That's the old idea. And in fact, most scientists would agree with that. So what's really going on? I think what's going on, it's a loss of the ability to read the genome correctly. Similar to how a chef, that when that person's very young, can make a beautiful cake or a sushi by reading the recipe, and then they lose their eyesight. They can't read the genome or the recipe very well. And so we have a mouse where we can disrupt that process. So now that mouse on the right cannot read its genome correctly, and it's going through what looks like a normal aging process, just at twice the normal rate. And we can dial that up. We have genetic ways of making them age faster or slower. So now that we know how aging, at least we think we know how aging works, we're working on molecules to be able to slow that process down and stop the body losing its ability to read the genome correctly. And I'll tell you about those molecules now. A lot of this work comes from yeast cells. So I left Sydney in 1995, supposedly for a couple of years. Got some experience at MIT in Boston. Unfortunately, those 2 years went a little too well, and if Harvard University makes you a job offer, it's very hard to turn them down. The studies in yeast were phenomenal. Who would have thought that you could learn about aging from something that's microscopic and makes bread? It turns out yeast cells get old, they get sick, and they die. They go through aging. And what we discovered was a set of genes in these yeast cells that protect the body from aging. And those genes have now become known as the sirtuins, named after the original gene called SIR2. And we have 7 of those genes in our body, and they exist in all of our organs. And we now know, thanks to thousands of publications over the last 20 years, that these are the main protectors of our body. And these are the genes that are kicked into action when you diet, when you exercise, and extremely potently when you calorie restrict. By the way, if you engineer mice with more of these genes, they're healthier and they live longer. So here you can see the sirtuins in blue. This is the paradigm that the field works under right now. As I've mentioned, we've got these effects up the top that you can go out, you can calorie restrict and exercise. What's going on is that they change certain molecules in the body. If you restrict amino acids, you'll shut down the mTOR pathway. If you restrict your glucose or eat less, you'll have less AMP kinase activity, which is the target of metformin. mTOR on the right is the target of rapamycin, that drug I mentioned earlier. And the sirtuins, that's what I've been working on. So I'm going to tell you about the sirtuins. But what I also wanted you to know is that these genetic pathways that the field has discovered are part of a network. And you can see with these arrows that they're talking to each other. They're sensing whether we're eating or sitting down. And they're sensing also how old we are. And what they do is they work on the various causes of aging. You can see I've listed telomeres, stem cell loss, cell senescence. So a lot of things go wrong during aging. And we're not trying to tackle each one of these individually. We're trying to get the body to defend against all of them. It's a very different matter. Okay? We're not trying to just develop a pill to polish the paint on that car. We're trying to get the body shop repair guys to work harder. So what do these sirtuin genes produce? I don't know if I can click that and make it move. All right, well, this is a molecule that normally would be doing a little dance there. Basically, the gene produces an enzyme. This is number 1 sirtuin, SIRT1, and it's the main defender of the body. It's found in every one of your cells in the body. And it's kicked into action by a couple of things. There are molecules that can bind to that blue region and make it more active. And what I'll also tell you about are molecules that also stimulate all of the sirtuins. These are the most effective molecules and hopefully drugs we have in the future. So what does this SIRT1 enzyme do in our bodies? Well, we know a lot. As I mentioned, there's papers about this now. And what we know is that diet and exercise will increase the activity of the SIRT1 molecule. And we can mimic that with small molecules like resveratrol and other drugs that we've been developing over the last 10 years. So SIRT1 protects various organs, and I just wanted to show you how effective it is. It works on the brain, protects the heart, the liver, burns fat, it helps against diabetes, and down below you can see it affects muscle. And that's going to be important when I show you what happens to a mouse when you stimulate the muscle with these molecules. One of the things to remember is that this is the best way to approach human health, in my view, and certainly others agree. If we were to just stop cancer today, does anyone want to guess the number of years that would extend average lifespan? Yep. 5? 20? 5, 20? Going once, going twice? The answer is 2.3, because all of our organs are aging at the same rate. And if you stop one cause of death, something else is just lurking behind. So despite the billions of dollars around the world that are spent on cancer, it's not going to have a big effect on average lifespan. But the anti-aging approach is, because all of the organs, including the brain, are kept in a youthful state. We also know that variants in the SIRT1 gene predict longevity. So when you follow up people who are elderly, starting at age 41, you can see that people have a certain variant in their DNA for SIRT1 tend to live longer. And there's more and more evidence that these longevity genes, as we call them, they have variants, and these predispose us either to disease or to longevity. But that's interesting, but it doesn't help us much. We're not going to genetically modify ourselves or our children anytime soon, though the technology currently exists to do that. What we want to do is to have a drug that would take all of us up to our maximum potential beyond what our genes have given us or our parents have given us. And so we wanted to essentially boost the levels of these enzymes that I'm telling about, these sirtuins. So in 2002, I said to my lab, we need to find an activator of these enzymes, because that would be the world's first anti-aging drug that could be prescribed. And so we did a screen. In other words, we looked at hundreds of thousands of molecules that would activate this enzyme that I was hoping would move on the screen. And we came up with one that looked really interesting. And at the time, it was the best one, this guy. And it's since become a pretty famous molecule. I assume that most of you have heard of this molecule. At the time, I'd never heard of it. I could barely pronounce it. But I Googled it, and it says, oh, it's found in red wine. And then from then on, I became known as the resveratrol red wine guy. But we've done a lot more. I want to tell you where we've come. So back in the early 2000s, what we did was we started feeding animals and even yeast cells resveratrol to see what would happen. And without any exceptions, we had yeast cells living longer, little worms in the dish living longer, by about 15 to 30%, ostensibly by mimicking the diet calorie restriction. And if we deleted those sirtuin genes, the molecule didn't work anymore. So we were very optimistic we were onto the right thing. We then fed them to mice. And the idea, actually just going back here, the idea was that if we took mice that were lean, they'd become more like calorie-restricted mice. And if we put them on a McDonald's diet, well, excuse me, I shouldn't say that, a high-fat Western diet. Actually, we literally call it the Western diet. Those mice get obese, and then we gave them resveratrol on top of that, asking whether we could mimic a lean diet. So here's what the mice looked like. There's a photo from the National Institutes of Health and my collaborator, Rafa de Cabo. And the mouse on the left is on the lean diet. The mouse in the middle is on the Western diet. And the mouse on the right is on the combo drug plus Western diet. And we were not very optimistic at this point. You can see that that mouse is not looking calorie restricted. And my poor postdoc at the time thought that his career was over after wasting 2 years of work. What happened, though, was when we opened up the mice, even though they were fat, their organs were pristine. They looked younger. They didn't have buildup of fat in the arteries. The livers looked young. And it wasn't just that we could see it. We gave these organs to pathologists, and they were blinded. They didn't know what they were looking at. And they came back and they picked the mouse on the right as the healthiest of all, which is really quite remarkable. It means that you can be obese, and there will be drugs that prevent the bad effects of having fat. They also lived longer. The mice in the red are the ones on the Western diet. This is a mortality curve. And the ones in the green are lean. And the ones with the combination high-fat diet plus resveratrol are in blue. So they didn't just look healthier, they were healthier. And they lived just as long as if they were on a healthy diet. I won't go through all the pathology. We've published it. But this was a remarkable effect. First time you could mimic calorie restriction even though animals were eating a high-fat diet. And the media went wild. Fortune magazine estimated that this drug, if it gets on the market, would be worth $26 billion a year, and that was 10 years ago. So what about drugs on the market? Well, we sold our company called Certris in 2009 to GlaxoSmithKline, and they continue to work on these drugs. They're not yet on the market, but they've made a lot of progress. They've made synthetic versions of drugs. They don't look like resveratrol, they're more advanced. And they've been in humans, actually. And they seem to work, not against aging, because that's not a disease yet. It's all a matter of regulation. But they do, as I'll show you, work in a disease related to aging. This is a mouse study, not a human study, but eventually we want a human equivalent. These are a couple of the drugs that were generated by GlaxoSmithKline. And there's one called 1720 and 2104. And when we fed those to mice, they lived longer. And these are not fat mice anymore. These are mice on a normal, healthy diet. So we're taking them another 10, 16% further than the healthiest possible mouse. Okay? And so imagine that if we could do that for humanity. That would certainly be a very different world. And this molecule at the bottom in blue, this SRT2104, has actually been in humans. And it's very safe. And what Glaxo did was they showed that it was effective at treating this disease called psoriasis, which is an inflammatory disorder. And this brings up an important point. These drugs cannot be prescribed for aging. Aging isn't a disease, and the only reason is that it's too common. Right? Really, that's the definition. If it affects more than 50% of the population, it's not a disease. I would argue it's the world's most common disease. So on the right, you can see quite effectively that person, after, I believe it was 40 days of treatment, had a dramatic effect. This was just eating capsules of 2104. Now, the reason this isn't on the market yet is only because that the molecule was really insoluble and didn't get through the stomach very well. So they've gone back and re-engineered the molecule, and they're going back into humans probably the end of this year or early next with some new fantastic soluble molecules. But I want to update you on some new molecules that we've been working on for the last 5 years. And that molecule is NAD. So can you see up there? Yeah, up there. The NAD molecule. So I mentioned to you that there were molecules like resveratrol that do this to that arm. There's other molecules that bind in the chest region of the enzyme, and one of those is NAD. So without NAD, sirtuins don't work. You need NAD. By the way, if you don't have NAD in your body, you're dead in about 20 seconds. So you want NAD. The problem is that as you get older, by the time you're 50, you have about half the levels of this NAD molecule that you had when you were in your 20s. So not surprisingly, we start to feel bad and become susceptible to diseases. So what we've been working on is molecules that stimulate and reinvigorate the production of NAD in the body. And then we could see what would happen. We predict that the sirtuins will be brought back to life in elderly mice and eventually elderly people. So this is our first molecule that we are putting in humans probably next month. We're just waiting on approval. This is called NMN, and its full name is a mouthful. It's nicotinamide mononucleotide, but essentially it's the immediate precursor molecule to NAD in the body. So we make it all the time, but just not a lot of it, and less as we get older. You can boost the levels of NAD up by exercising and dieting, but here is a way to do it artificially. So I'm going to show you a bit of data. We've done a lot of experiments, and the field has shown that NMN is very effective at mimicking caloric restriction. We now know it even makes mice live longer, just by putting it in their food or in their water. And it's a very safe molecule because it's naturally occurring. What I want to show you today is unpublished work that addresses the problem of frailty. And frailty is one of the biggest problems because it also leads to all these other diseases here. And the main problem is that as we lose our ability to exercise, our bodies also become increasingly less responsive to exercise. Okay? Even if you put an elderly person on a treadmill, they're not going to become a marathon runner. And we were wondering why. And not only that, why? The second question is, why can't you take a person here, poor Burt Reynolds, can we make Burt go back to here? Wouldn't that be something? And then he could then get back on a treadmill and reverse that cycle. Now that's what we're aiming for. We can actually do this in mice quite easily. We put this NMN molecule in their water, they drank it for a month, and then we put them on a treadmill. Now apologies for black mice on black treadmills, but I think you can tell which mouse has been drinking the NMN. Actually, the mouse on the bottom gave up, and someone once joked that that mouse is smarter than the other one. But actually, when you test them, the mouse on the left is also smarter. So these are the tablets that we're going to be using in our first clinical trial. The first trial, please don't ask to sign up for the trial. I get emails every day. Eventually, there will be bigger trials. This one's just going to be 30 people, volunteers, to see if it's safe. We're not expecting any issues, so we'll move rapidly into tests of endurance, tests of strength, tests of bodily functions, inflammation, and blood sugar. And this will give us a signal whether or not we're really mimicking caloric restriction. We're aiming to use this in a number of ways. We want to do a clinical trial here in Australia, treating metabolic diseases, such as mitochondrial diseases, where there's not enough energy in the cells. This is very good at boosting energy. It's also a very good cure for jet lag, if you're wondering. And as Pamela mentioned, we work with NASA now. We won a competition solving the problem of how do you get to Mars without having cancer? Because you're bombarded by cosmic rays. It's, on a trip to Mars, 5% of all your cells will die, and the remaining ones will be hugely damaged. And so we thought, instead of protecting the spacecraft, we want to protect the genome. And so we proposed that. So now we're testing this. The last couple of slides, I want to just tell you that there's also a whole revolution, and I expect many of you are aware of this. This is one that I sit on the board of. This is a company that was spun out of MIT. It's called Inside Tracker. And for someone can come to your house, take your blood, or you can go to, say, a phlebotomist. And then what happens is they track your blood over 35 markers. It's cheaper than having it done by a doctor. And I've actually been tracking myself for the last 6 years. And I can see what goes up, what goes down, what do I do that makes me better, what do I do that makes it worse. And they also use AI to give you recommendations of food and lifestyle. And they can also estimate your biological age based on true correlates of longevity, inflammation, blood glucose, testosterone. These things correlate with lifespan. And so I was looking at my biological age, and it was going up and up and up. I was actually older than my age. I hit 57, and I thought, if I die young, this is not going to be a good look for the field. So in 2014, I took my health into my own hands, and I went on 2 of the molecules that I've told you about today. I started taking metformin, which I could get in Thailand, on my way to Australia. I was borderline diabetic, so if you can be prescribed this drug. And I also went on NMN, which currently is not widely available, but hopefully will be soon. And so I'm going to show you what these independent tests showed my age to be over a period of 3 months. See the graph on the bottom? The red line is my age going up. And then when I started taking these molecules, you can see that I plummeted. I don't know if you can see the ages, but that top peak is 57 point something. The bottom that I landed at 3 months later, 31.4. And not only did that tell me that I was doing well, my body told me I was doing well. I felt younger. People said I looked younger. I certainly had more energy. And so I think that this graph is hopefully the first of many similar graphs across the globe where people can potentially alter not just how they feel, but how long they live. And I may have given myself another 15 years of life here. I don't know for sure, but if I'm around in another 60 years, we'll know something's going on. By the way, my father, who's 70, almost 78, is also taking these medicines. Voluntarily, I'm not forcing anybody. And he just climbed the highest mountain in Tasmania. And my brother, who's 35 years younger, could barely keep up. So it's so far so good. And so I just want to end by saying, I think the world that our children are going to live in and their grandchildren for generations beyond are going to live in a very different world where people, they don't have to worry about getting cancer in their 60s and 70s. And they don't have to worry about becoming frail in their 80s and 90s. And when they reach that point, they'll wonder why we didn't work on this sooner. Thank you for having me.
Got a seat. So, David, if you're closer to 50 than 40, and I'm closer to 40 than 50, I think we now know why you look younger. And if you missed any of that, it's metformin and MNN. MNM.
Not M&Ms.
Maybe that's why I look the way I do.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a huge number of questions, and I think the audience will as well. Can we start with one question that you focused a lot on the body, naturally. How resilient do you think our minds will be to aging? And, you know, is the mind equipped to live a 200-year lifespan?
I mean, the obvious answer that you know what I'm going to give is, yeah, absolutely, our minds can handle it. But what we need to do is to keep them functioning well. And there are a number of things we need to do. We need to stop proteins building up in the brain, and the brain tends to do that. Alzheimer's is a good example. We don't know a lot about Alzheimer's disease, actually, and one of the things that's held us back as a community is that we study Alzheimer's in young mice, which is about the worst thing to do, because Alzheimer's is a disease of aging. So those mice that I showed you where we can speed up the aging process, we're turning those into a model for Alzheimer's. So instead of having mice live 2 years, they effectively experience 80 years of aging. And we hope that that will be able to allow us to find drugs that work against Alzheimer's and brain aging. The other thing that's important is that I showed you those mice can run about 50% further. The reason they run further is not, they don't just have more energy, but they have better blood flow. The capillaries in the blood, in the muscle, they grow again as though it's young. And we see the same thing happen in the brain. So vascular dementia also may be a thing of the past.
So we're going to open up to questions on the floor. If you want to put up your hand, we've got some roving mics over there. Whilst we're getting a mic over there, one other question which I think many in the audience will be interested in, I particularly am, because it sounds like by the time a lot of this stuff gets to a point where it's out there in the field, I may have missed the boat. Do you think we're going to see drugs, and I think, you know, some of your later work showed that maybe we will, but that will actually help us reverse the signs of aging for those of us who are, you know, going to get there when, you know, maybe it feels too late?
Well, it could happen sooner than you think, than most people think. The clinical trial path that we're on, if everything goes well, we're 4 years away. Not everything goes well. You know, these drugs for psoriasis have taken a lot longer. But I'm confident, or more confident, that these other molecules, because they're naturally occurring, or derivatives of those molecules, will be able to go quicker. And we don't have those solubility issues. So 4 years away is not too late for anybody. In fact, what we show with these mice that run further, that's true aging reversal. Those mice were 20 months old. That's like a 75-year-old. And they can now run like a 20-year-old. So some organs are very easy to reverse. Muscle, liver, even brain, we find that we can rapidly reverse aging within a week.
Wow.
Doesn't mean you'll look younger necessarily.
Question from the floor?
Hi there, good morning. Your talk gives us all a lot of hope, I think. So I think I have a question that everybody has here in this room. 2 keywords, you said the diet and the exercise. So what kind of diet, what kind of exercise? I've heard about time-restricted eating. I've heard about running into the sauna and cold showers like the Swedes do. Can you give us some advice?
Yes, there are a lot of opinions out there. I'll give you mine. Skipping a couple of days a week makes scientific sense. Being hungry is helpful if you can do it. I tend to try to skip 1 meal a day if I can. I try to feel hungry at least once per day if I can. It's not always possible. And what we find with the mice is that if we make them hungry and then we give them food, they'll eat a lot of food, but they still live longer. So the total calories isn't necessarily the issue. It's having that period of hunger that's more important. So I would do that. I wouldn't eat a lot of protein. We know that having a lot of amino acids in your body from protein turns off one of these pathways, that one that I showed you called mTOR. But you know, some people say don't eat fat, don't eat protein, don't eat carbohydrate. And there are reasons for all of those. So overall, I would say if you eat a balanced diet, but reduce the amount, then that's the best result. And again, be a little hungry occasionally. On exercise, definitely exercise, but you don't have to run a marathon. You can sprint for 5 minutes and get benefits, and that's what I do, because I hate exercise.
Hi, just a quick question. With the anti-aging, maybe our organs might be healthier, but one of the challenges when you do exercise is we wear out our joints. Does this anti-aging drug help our cartilage at all, or cartilages and joints health?
We don't know. We in the field typically focus on other parts of the body because that's what we know. What I could tell you is that every organ we've looked at or every system is protected. So it would surprise me if the joints aren't also protected. I could tell you, at least for the bones, we protect against osteoporosis. But we honestly don't know. One of the things also is that I mentioned anti-inflammatory action. So for things like rheumatoid arthritis, we're optimistic that we could delay that or reverse it. But that's an area that's been neglected, unfortunately. But in terms of wearing out your joints, this is one of the reasons that I tell myself I don't need to run a lot. So, you know, again, do intense exercise, but you don't have to run every day, I don't think.
Second question is, sorry, the governments, have they been supportive of this at all?
Where are we?
Sorry, back again.
Oh,
Second question, yeah. Have they been supportive of this type of drug, like they see it as a benefit from funding health in general?
Not as much as you would think, given the impact on the planet and the need for it with the aging population. China is getting very interested in this area at the state level. In the US, the NIH budget is a large one, but less than 0.4% is devoted to this research, and there's 100 times more devoted to diseases like cancer and Alzheimer's. In fact, it's so bad that I have to write grants to study Alzheimer's just so I can get money to study aging. Not that Alzheimer's isn't important, but this could prevent Alzheimer's or treat it, and as a side effect, prevent all other diseases as well. So not a lot of support from governments, and I'm actually working on having a foundation that would raise more than $100 million with an individual in New York who I can't name yet. And our vision is to have funding at a level that would not just fund the science, but also have a Davos-type meeting every year to explain to governments and to citizens of the world that this is an area that we should definitely focus on.
Sorry, my question was actually quite similar. I was wondering the impediment to the FDA, the kind of lead time it takes to kind of realise your kind of research. So.
Yeah, the FDA is at least interested. The FDA currently, as I mentioned, defines aging as something that's natural and not treatable. I cringe every time somebody says, yes, but it's a natural process. Well, 100 years ago, dying from a splinter was natural too. We don't allow that to happen anymore. We think it's a tragedy to lose a life. FDA, though, is now, over the last 2 years, thinking about calling aging a disease, but they want some proof that you can treat it first. And there's a study called TAME, which I'm helping Neil Barzilai do with metformin. And the FDA has agreed if we can hit these milestones, they will at least consider calling aging a treatable disease. And if and when that happens, then the floodgates will open for investment and interest.
You pose a interesting challenge for the World Anti-Doping Agency. I'm just wondering if they've approached you yet, because when we're all popping these pills in 5 to 6 years from now, is a concept of the natural athlete dead and buried?
So they did approach me a few years ago about the resveratrol work, but they haven't approached me about the new work. I expect they will. It's quite difficult to detect these molecules because they're naturally occurring and they're cleared out very quickly. So it's going to be, let's call it an issue to figure out. Can I give you an anecdote? A friend of a friend is a CrossFit trainer, a CrossFit athlete, I should say, and he was coming about 70th place in his age group. He took this stuff and came second a couple of months ago.
If you know Phil, he's quite an athlete, so I know where his question's coming from.
And where do I get it? Yeah.
Pam, while we're waiting for a mic for Pam, it raises an obvious question. I'm an irresponsible person, had 6 children. We can't have large families in a world where people are living 200 years. How much does your work push up against sort of, the work around our environment and the capacity of the world to bear human population?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are 2 important points. One is that even if we stopped aging today, the population wouldn't go up more than the rate of immigration. It's not that we'll suddenly have too many people. So there'll be time to adapt. We can't all have 6 children, obviously, in a world like that. We can't even have 3 in a world like that. But a lot of people don't have kids. But what happens, as you've seen, with nations that become healthy tend to have fewer children. But there are other issues. So the second point is that there will be more of us, no matter whether I'm successful or not. And we have to find places for us to live and ways for us to have less impact on the planet. So, for example, I'm working with a guy who is building new high-rises for living space that allows us to live a more interesting existence, but also in communities. I'm also working with the world's largest food producer to reduce the impact on the world and reduce the cost of food for a world that I can see coming soon.
Pamela?
David, just a question about the amount that we spend, particularly in developed countries, on health, and in particular the cost of the last year of life, where I understand most of our health budget is actually spent. With this idea that people will live healthier longer, do we still have that problem of the last year of life with a very expensive health budget? And if not, what are we going to die from?
Yeah. Good question. So the mice die from natural causes, so normal causes, I should say. It's all natural, but they die much quicker. So if if you're going to die from chronic heart disease and have a heart attack, these mice die from a heart attack still. They still get cancer. But what's interesting is that they die much more quickly. And that's true in humans. The longer you live, the quicker you die. That's a fact. And much less burden on the healthcare system. And so based on everything we know, you won't spend a year in a nursing home. You might spend a few weeks in hospital and then die, but be quite happy and healthy up to that point for most people.
All right, David, unfortunately, as you can hear from the crowds outside, we're at time and ready for the next session. It's been a genuine pleasure. Thank you for coming and speaking to us today.